Hello everyone, and welcome to this FMB webinar on Tuesday the 19th of January. Too late to say Happy New Year to you again, but thank you for joining us today, and I hope everybody watching is well. And if you joined us for last Tuesday's webinar, you'll know that we had technical difficulties, so you didn't get to hear much of Sarah's presentation. So we've combined the content from that webinar with this one. So we're going to be slightly longer than usual. We normally aim to finish these webinars in about 45 minutes, but probably this will go on for about an hour or so. So thank you to Sarah for doing that with the webinar content, for merging both of those into one. And apologies to those of you who turned up last week and all you heard was 5 minutes of me waffling on, really, because I was hoping that Sarah will be able to rejoin us. So our speaker for today is Sarah Fox, the 500-word lawyer, and we're going to be talking about managing changes to your contracts and also managing your risks and liabilities through your contracts. And this is the 5th and 6th webinars in a series of 8 altogether. The previous ones are all on the FMB website if you'd like to have a look at those. And Sarah's going to go through a little bit of a recap on what the content of those was, if you think you might like to go and take a look at those. And the following ones will be on the 26th of January and the 2nd of February. So if you've attended all of them, well done, and you've got a really comprehensive set of advice and information about using the FMB suite of contracts, or any contract, I guess. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so please put your questions and comments in there, on the basis that there's no such thing as a daft question. If you're thinking of a question, probably somebody else is as well, so please pop those in the box and we'll try and deal with as many of those as we can at the end of the session. So that's the housekeeping out of the way, and I'll now hand over to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Hayley. So I do apologise for anyone who was on the session last week and was struggling with the fact that we had a power cut locally, so we couldn't do anything. But as we've said on all of these, your contracts are tools to help you demonstrate to your clients that you understand their needs, you're competent, you're trustworthy, and what they can expect when you work with them. So in session 1, we looked at the importance of simplifying your contracts to create confidence with your clients, because they may never have done a construction project or building project. And so they may be full of those myths that they've got from TV programs. You need to safeguard your business, and we're going to talk about how you limit your liability and safeguard your business later in this session, and also how you can avoid disputes by making sure that it's really clear what both of the parties have to do. Then in session 2, we looked at the bare minimum you need. Now, often if people don't have contracts, then they will have an estimate, a proposal, which sets out the fees and the works and the parties. And that is the minimum that you need to create a contract. However, there are other things that really you should be seeking to get into your contracts, and the FMB suite obviously complies with all the other things you'd expect to see in a contract. In session 3, we looked at clarifying payment issues. We know that the construction contracts apply to commercial projects, but we also know that the Consumer Rights Act applies and relates to pricing for consumer and domestic projects. And we also looked at times for completion. We know that time is a bit of a flexible thing, and at the moment, certainly there are a lot of lockdowns happening, restrictions, difficulty in getting supplies, all of those things. So time is being a little bit flexible at the moment, and it's important that that's part of your contract as well, so your client understands that any completion date is a potentially movable feast. And then in session 4, we looked at quality standards. And the reason it's really important to look at quality standards is that everybody's understanding of quality means something slightly different. And we know that there have been cases where people have talked about to the best possible quality standard, and their suppliers have interpreted it differently. It's also important that when we're looking at quality, we're describing what the client wants us to do, what it wants to achieve. And in fact, if we look at the construction playbook that the government has just launched, it's looking at very much outcome-based projects. So what does this project got to do at the end, not how many bricks have we put into it and how much time have we put into it. So those are the things we've covered in the first 4 sessions. And we did cover this briefly before the power went last week. But we're looking at the January 2021 lockdown provisions across the nations. The Northern Ireland restrictions are slightly different again, but in all the nations, work can continue. Possibly the most restrictive area is Scotland, where tradespeople are only allowed to visit homes if the work is essential. Again, all of the nations have given guidelines for construction projects so that people understand how to apply social distancing and safe methods of working. So please go to the FMB website. It's got lots of links to that information, and you can find it out very quickly using the FMB website. So the first thing I want to do is look at the first poll. I think this is where we got to last week before the power went down. But Hayley, if you could launch the first poll for me, please. So we're trying to find out whether we've had any new negative impact since the January 2021 lockdown, relating to the lockdown itself and not relating to anything else which might be going on in the UK, particularly Brexit. So there's some new impacts, but it's kind of a mixed picture, really. And I'm sorry that if you have had negative impacts on your projects. I know that there's lots of problems going on around the UK, but we'll try and deal with what we can in this session. So we looked at previous projects about the bare minimum. So we looked in session 1 about the who and the what, or session 2 about the who and the what. In session 3, we looked at how much and when. And in session 4, we looked at quality standards and aims. And the next few sessions, 5, 6 and 7, we'll be looking at managing the project. And managing the project means creating a workable contract. So the other things that are very important, but we know that the construction projects don't necessarily all go precisely as to plan. We know that there are external factors like lockdowns and Brexit and strikes and weather. I hope you're not in one of the regions which is currently facing a flood warning. But we know that there are lots of things, external factors and internal factors, that can change the best laid plans of our clients. So we need to look at beyond the bare minimum to look at how we can create effective contracts. So we need this extra depth. So all these elements are set out in the FMB suite of contracts, and of course, and if you're interested, if you want to get more information, I have a book on how to write effective small works contracts, which does go into more detail so you can understand a bit more about these issues. So we're going to be dealing with some of the procedures in this. We're also going to be dealing with risk, and we're going to be dealing with excluding and limiting liability in this session. As we said, we've merged 2 sessions together. In session 7, we're going to look at remedies and cancellation, particularly cancellation in terms of consumer rights under the Consumer Rights Act 2015. And then we're going to be looking at termination, how you can bring projects to an end. And there was a lot of talk about remedies when the first lockdown happened. Generally speaking, I think that there is a fairly well understood approach across the industry to these things, but it's still worth looking at them in some detail in the next session. So now we want to try and find out what the impact of COVID on your business has been. And that's taking us back to March 2020 to the present day. So Hayley, if you could launch the next poll, please. So just to confirm that the last item on that poll is saying that really the problem that a lot of people faced when it came to the impact of COVID and lockdowns was that there was nothing in their contract which told them exactly what they should be doing next. So some people were really struggling with trying to get agreement with their clients or their supply chain as to what they should be doing on their projects. That's project team based rather than government. So the micro rather than the macro level. I'm not surprised actually, I'm quite surprised that there has been no impact of clients not being able to pay. The majority of people have said, obviously, extra costs incurred, and that may be because of social distancing, PPE, extra equipment, more people. A few of you have had more disputes, nobody wanting to cancel things before they happened. Some clients wanting to terminate, delays, of course, due to workforce unavailability, lack of a route map. Yeah, so there has been some issues, but the majority of problems are caused by the extra costs, and that's fairly consistent across the industry. So one of the things, all of those aspects were about managing changes during the project. And in fact, although at the beginning of lockdown, a lot of talk was about force majeure and frustration, which are two very legal terms, actually the whole process of lockdown and the restrictions that we've had were about managing changes, and maybe not in the traditional sense of managing changes where we think of changes to the scope and everything else, but actually managing changes to how the project is going to be carried out. So contracts are not just about the scope of works you're doing, but they also explain how you're going to work with your client. So your contract has to set out the process of getting from where your client is now to where they want to be. Now that path can seem very obvious, and particularly when it's a project you've done lots of times before, probably until March this year, you didn't really give much thought to how things might change. But lockdown and COVID has certainly made us think a bit more about how changes can impact on our project and the procedures that we have in our contracts to deal with this sort of thing. So there's been lots of news about the various different issues to do with the lockdown, and also to do with change generally. And this was a survey by the FMB, which talked about material shortages, reduced workloads as a result of the COVID issue. So really important to realise that if your costs rise, do you have an opportunity to change your price on a project? If you've got a project that's going to last a couple of years that straddled COVID and Brexit, then how did you price that? Did you take it into account, or did your clients think that their price could change? So it's really important that contracts do have a change clause, because as we have learnt very well in the last 9 months, sometimes we can't expect everything. We can't plan for all the unexpected. It's really important to have a change clause to manage client expectations. A lot of unsophisticated clients, particularly domestic clients, kind of believe the project is rather set in stone, that the time won't change, that the cost won't change, and the scope won't change. And obviously a change clause actually alerts them to the fact that the project could change once it's started. It also includes flexibility for the client and contractor. Clients obviously change their mind or refine their requirements, but that allows them to have more work done and use the same contractor. But also that you as a contractor can, because of material shortages, change goods, works or services where necessary to meet market changes, to meet availability, to meet the new context that you're working in. And the other thing is we need a change clause, because if we don't have any provision in the contract allowing us to change the contract or to change the scope of works, then we would need a new contract for that. Now, if we're doing an extra bit of works, that's complicated, but it's not as complicated as if we're taking something out and replacing it, or if we're substituting different types of internal fittings or brickwork or everything else. So if we need a new contract, we're going back to session 2 when we looked at what you need to create a contract: offer, acceptance, consideration, certainty. All of that becomes a bit complex when we could just have a simple change procedure. So it's really important to remember that you need a change clause to give you this flexibility for the time of the project. So there was a case in 2003 which talked about how important change clauses were, and it was very important to say that sometimes we just have to realise something is no longer needed. And I suspect there's quite a number of commercial projects who are now looking at whether or not the sort of office blocks that they're building in the City of London are quite what people will be needing, or whether people have decided they don't want an extra bedroom, but they do need an extra home study. So change allows us to move with the times and move with the context. Now, if you've been with us through any of the previous sessions, then we've come across this project before. This was a project in the site of a former telephone exchange in London, and Mr. Mackay started a project, and it was a traditional contract with some elements of design and build. Now, it ended up in a bit of a full-blooded conflict. They basically came to blows on paper. But this contract started as a price, just one of these blocks, started with a price of £5.5 million. Now, it's quite a lot of money for a house, but the actual final cost, as ascertained by the court, was a whopping £11 million. So the project had doubled in price. But what had happened was the client had not followed any of the change procedures correctly in the contract. By the time it went to court, there were 1,700 requests for formal variations which hadn't been responded to by the client or its contract administrator. The client had basically ignored the processes. This had resulted in a multi-million pound dispute. And I believe as a result of the dispute, the client actually had to sell the property to pay the legal costs. So it's really important, if we have procedures, they're simple enough for people to follow and for people to use. And that means everyone from the sophisticated client to the brand newbie. So really important that we can manage change effectively, because you don't want to be in the position of having to sue your clients to pay the extras that they weren't for some reason expecting. So effective procedures are important because they allow our clients to follow the process, to give notices or to agree before they make changes. So it allows them to effectively make an informed decision and to understand the knock-on effects. So what are the knock-on effects of changing the paintwork? It could be virtually nothing. It could change the quality or the aesthetics. It could change the price because it might have gone for something more expensive, a Farrow and Ball paint instead of a Wix special. And it could change the completion dates if those materials are much harder to get hold of. So change happens all the time, incrementally and in big scale on projects. But what I want to find out is whether or not you actually agree changes with clients before you carry them out. So do you get your client to agree the knock-on effects, price, quality, and cost, before price, quality, and time before you do them where possible?
I think most people have voted now, Sarah. I don't think we've ever had a result where it's been 50-50 between two of the answers. But there we are.
Oh, well, there you go.
Always and sometimes.
Well, on the plus side, it's not split equally across to the never. It's really useful to agree those knock-on changes with a client before, because it stops surprises. Most clients do not like unwelcome surprises. Even if they think they've ordered more changes or more work, they don't really get it until they've been told that that's how much it's going to cost and that's how much time it's going to take. So here are just samples from two of the FMB contracts. Obviously, the small works contract and the domestic contract have slightly different provisions, but both of them allow changes for unforeseen problems, changes to the works. It could be substitution, addition, or omission of works. So there's lots of different ways that work changes can happen to the works. And they talk about also unexpected events in both of these contracts. So one of the things that is really important to look at is, although a client can omit works, there is effectively a right to finish a project. So where you sign a contract with a client for a project, then you have a right to finish all of the scope of works. Client can ask you to omit works, but it's best if that is priced in advance so you understand it. Some clients have used a right to omit works in order to effectively terminate your contract early, and that's considered by the courts not to be the right to use of a change provision. So it's really important to remember that if a client does want to start taking away big chunks of work, maybe because they no longer want it or maybe because they've run out of money, that you have an adult grown-up conversation about the fact that if they do that, that's effectively preventing you earning the profit on that omitted scope, and you should be compensated for it. So really important to remember that clients cannot use a change procedure effectively to terminate your contract without proving that there's a reason for termination. So we've got all sorts of other reasons why we might need a change clause. This is another one of the issues that we've got facing the industry. And generally speaking, contracts, and if you've seen other forms of standard form contract, you'll see a long list of events which entitle you to more time or more money. And they generally fall, however, into three basic categories. There's client acts and omissions. So that's things that they've done, not allowing you onto site, preventing you doing things. There's also changes to the works, changes to the scope, and there's also unexpected and uncontrollable events like Brexit and COVID. So they're dealt with obviously in the FMB contracts, and in the domestic contract, we've got client acts and omissions as section 14.1. We've got statutory suspension for non-payment, which is again another client act or omission in 14.2. We've got changes in 14.3, and we've got unexpected matters. Now, we don't define what all those unexpected matters are. We just say they might include bad weather or civil commotion. But that's a provision which would cover things like COVID and Brexit, because the extent to which they've affected the work in the industry has been unexpected. And although we knew Brexit was coming, we didn't know the form of it. So the impact of Brexit is still an unexpected event. So again, this is a picture of a pool that you might have seen before. I'm not just trying to make you wish for summer, although we are all probably wishing for summer. I don't know about you, but currently it's dark and wet where I live. Now, in this pool was a result of a court claim which went all the way to the House of Lords and now the Supreme Court, where a client entered into a project contract for a pool of a specific depth. He wanted one that was 7'6", and it actually was built to a deep end of 6 foot. Now, one of the ways that they could have avoided the litigation, which was actually to change the specification after the works had been completed. Now, it turned out that this client was a bit of a bulldog and didn't want to let it lie. But that is one of the ways of dealing with defects which are effectively impossible to rectify. Because the expert opinion said that this pool was just as good for swimming in and diving in as the deeper pool that he'd asked for. And that there was no difference to the client except maybe a little bit less water to heat. So one of the ways they could have made that contract right and to avoid a big claim which took years to go to the Supreme Court would have been to change the specification after completion. And that is possible. You can change the scope of works after completion to reflect what's actually been done on site. And it is sort of it requires the parties really to act in a fairly sophisticated manner, but it is a possibility to avoid lingering unrest and disputes from happening. So why do we need to bother with change procedures? Well, procedures should be simple and easy to follow, because if they're not followed, then there could be a question about whether you're entitled to get paid. Now, if you've carried out extra works that weren't in the original scope and the client instructed them, then likely is that you will get paid. But if you've had to adapt the scope to meet the current situation and the client wasn't expressly instructing you to do that, then they might think that you are trying to swap or substitute materials in order to make more profit. They might not be happy with it. They might refuse to pay you. And the extra cost and time involved with changes can result in disputes. So really important to remember how you're going to get paid is by communicating as soon as you can. Again, the reason we need to get that communication in early, as soon as it's been that decision is being made, is firstly so the client can decide yes or no to accept a substitution or a change, but also to avoid nasty surprises which tend to end up in complaints and disputes. And as I've said, to allow the client to make informed decisions. And the change procedure should basically set out the changes to the price and any completion dates. And the one thing that you can do, although the FMB suites don't do it, is to put a maximum limit on the amount of change you can have. So in the example we had of that luxury mansion, the client could have put a restriction in the contract that said the original price is 5.5 million. We accept that not all the design is complete yet, so we'll give you a maximum budget of £9 million, which is still a huge increase in price, but that no variations will take us above 9 million. Particularly for clients who haven't done this sort of project, may have limited funding or limited capital, really useful for them to focus their mind. If you're going to put a maximum limit on value, though, you have to keep being on top of the current project cost, because there's no point keeping doing work and then only realising when you tot it all up that you've now gone over the maximum limit. because you may find that you can't get paid. So maximum limits can work to try and squash the client from constantly making little changes, to focus their attention, to make sure that you can get paid because they can get the money from somewhere, but also to allow you and to effectively encourage you to stay on top of costs as the project proceeds, rather than, for example, scrappy bits of receipts somewhere hidden in the back of the office or in a van. So we've looked at managing change. Now, change events are effectively one of the risk events that we look at on contracts. And in this section, which is the original section 6, we're going to look at changes, insurance and limits on liability. Now, we've already talked about changes to the contract. So we need to think about how we manage risk, and a lot of standard form contracts, and the FMB contracts are the same, set out the risk events and the mechanisms for managing risk and the rewards that go with them. So it explains whether or not you're going to get time or money. Now, in a lump sum contract, if a risk is not written into the contract, then the builder, the constructor, takes the risk and the cost of that event. So really important that you understand what risks belong to you and what risks belong to the client. And contracts should manage risk, because there's no such thing as a risk-free project in construction. It's really important that we understand. And there was a case to do with a television mast which collapsed in bad weather, where the court looked at projects and they said a project may be alluring, and that was to a contractor, not necessarily to a client. Generally, projects are more alluring to clients, but moving on. He said, but the risks of that project may be so substantial and their elimination so difficult to ensure with certainty that the only proper course is to walk away and to abandon the project. Sometimes not doing the project is common sense, and any other decision is foolhardy. And they went on to say the law requires even pioneers to be prudent. Now, I suspect that most of the projects you do aren't pioneering in that sense. But if you do sort of state-of-the-art or more pioneering projects, you still have to be sure that you can carry them out. Because if you've contracted to do something, which then proves to be impossible, I'm afraid to say that's a dispute waiting to happen, and you can be held liable. And there's a history of cases where contractors have overpromised, under-delivered, and ended up carrying the costs of that under-delivery. So really important that you understand how contracts manage risk. And we talked in previous sessions about this case, which was to do with a basement works that went horribly wrong. And this property was demolished fairly soon after this picture was taken because it was structurally unsound, and both parties lost their property completely. But the risks were that the client hadn't taken into account the fact that they wanted the works to be supervised. They couldn't afford supervision. They didn't realise that once a contractor had become insolvent, then its insurance didn't work because the contractor was insolvent. There was no insurer to claim against. It didn't realise that the engineer who designed the basement works had no continuing liability for supervision. So they hadn't really thought about the huge risks of doing basement works. Now, basement works have this risk, and there are a number of people who've suffered poor basement works because they can obviously take your whole property down if done badly. So understanding and identifying risks is really important. Adding a greenhouse to your garden is nowhere near as risky as adding a basement to an existing building, particularly a semi-detached building in a tight space. So understanding the risks for that particular project are really important, but also for the project team as a whole. So we've talked in previous sessions about this timeline that we imported into the new FMB contracts. And the purpose for this was to try and identify for clients how risk events could change time as well as money. So we know that various events could delay the project. It could be that you've provided late access, unlikely to change the cost of the project. But there could be suspensions if the client fails to pay on time. It could be that there are changes to the scope that'll change could change both the completion date and the amount of money payable. Or there could be unexpected events which also change both the time and money. And these were just ways of trying to highlight to clients how important it is for them to understand how the project could change from day one. Because clients seem to get very heavily emotionally invested in what they were told early on in a project. It's a bit like if you look at the press to do with the high-speed rail link to HS2 as it's known, and they're constantly talking about the costs increasing, the timescales increasing and everything else. And that's because we have imperfect information at the start of a project. And that's true of any project you do for a client. The information that you have is not enough to give you a very fixed price. So it's really important that clients understand that there is this flexibility in construction contracts and that it has to respond to risk events. They're not just buying a coffee. It's not a quick in, quick out project. This is a project which is going to take time, and things could happen. And I think maybe the one benefit of COVID is if there is a tiny silver lining, and I know that you've all been affected and you've probably also had personal effects, but if there's a tiny silver lining to the whole last 9 months, it's that clients now really get that external events, unexpected external events, can have a big impact on their project. They kind of get that if they fail to pay, or if they fail to give you possession, or if they change their mind, that's likely to have a knock-on effect. They've never really thought about the external effects on and the impact that could have on their project before. So one of the ways when we look at risk is also to think about how risk is transferred to insurers. And there's a whole section, this is only a small part of it, in relation to insurance in the FMB suite. It's really important that we have clients insuring their own property and not requiring you to do so, but also that you having adequate insurance as well relating to the works. So the insurance provisions mirror what we'd expect you to have in any event. So, Hayley, can you just launch our last poll, please? So one of the things I'm quite interested in is whether or not you limit your liability in your contracts. Now, it could be that it depends whether or not it's a consumer contract as opposed to a commercial contract, but I'd be quite interested in finding out whether or not you limit your liability. Certainly when I started in the construction sector some decades ago, limits on contractors' liability was not as common as limits on consultant liability.
There we go. I'll just end that poll and share the results.
Interesting that 60% of you do, and well done. Those of you who've said depends on the client, obviously that's a commercial decision, but if you never limit your liability, I would very highly recommend you do. Because limiting your liability is a way of managing the risks of the project, and you shouldn't bet your business on a specific project. Because of all the cases I've seen and all the disputes, it's very difficult to spot the ones that are going to end up in the courts in advance. So by limiting your liability, you're kind of not having to try and do that mystic, the meg thing of forecasting which of the events you get involved in, which of the projects could end up in the courts. You're effectively safeguarding your business in advance. So why should you bother to think about risk? Well, as I've said before, if risks are not listed, then generally speaking, you as a contractor will pay for the costs of those. And it's one of the things that's come out of a lot of the contracts, the standard form contracts in relation to the pandemic and the restrictions, is that the changes in work, the health and safety and well-being of employees on site is a contractor risk, and they're looking at higher costs as a result. And we've talked about the higher costs of workforce and all that kind of stuff earlier in this session. So really important to remember. It's also useful to have a procedure for these known unknowns. So the sort of things we're expecting, changes, client tax, but changes to price and completion dates to deal with that. But it's very difficult to cover every eventuality, and the lists of events that you see are often not as helpful as we think they would be, because almost none of the standard form contracts mentioned pandemics in their contract, and they didn't mention government restrictions relating to pandemics, particularly those issued under health and safety legislation. But also what we can do is limit your liability for unknown unknowns, for the things that we're not aware of. We don't know that the materials are going to fail. We don't know that particular components don't meet international standards. We don't know whether the ground that we're building on is absolutely correct, but we're pretty sure. So we can't have certainty in everything, but it's really useful to limit liability. And the FMB contracts, the larger contracts, do have a maximum total limit on your liability, excluding claims for death or personal injury. Under English law, you cannot exclude any liability or limit your liability for death or personal injury or fraud. So really important to remember that. That's not sort of weasel words, it's just trying to reflect what the legislation actually says. So in this session, and I know we've merged two sessions together, a bit of a fast, rapid run through the two aspects, is we're looking at managing risks and not betting your business on a project. If you wouldn't take your business and take it to the casinos in, any casino anywhere in the world, should you be allowed to travel, then if you wouldn't do that, then you should make sure that you don't bet your business in your contracts in a similar sort of way. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Hayley, shall we have a look at the questions?
Yeah, I can't see any questions in the box as yet, but if any of the people attending the webinar do have a question for Sarah, then please pop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But I've got one or two questions myself, actually, Sarah, based on queries that I've had from members in the past. First of all, around that box that you just showed us where members can put in an amount limiting their liability, that could be quite a tricky amount to calculate. Do you have any sort of rules of thumb that members can use to determine what kind of amount they should be putting in there?
So the simple answer is that the limit has to be reasonable to be enforceable under English law. So generally speaking, what we've seen in the past is lots of people write their insurance limit in that box. Now, it doesn't have to be the amount of your insurance, because if you're only doing a sort of £10,000 project, but you've got £1 million worth of insurance, then that's quite a big difference. So the courts have looked at what might be a reasonable limit on liability, and it's somewhere between 4 and 10 times the project price or the total final value. So given that you have to write it in at the beginning, you kind of need to think about how the price might change during the course of the project. So would it go up 50% like that posh mansion in London did, or might it be, it could double? But you need to think about what the total risk for the clients could be if it's wrong. And it's like the basement works. The cost of the basement works weren't very expensive, but the total dispute was valued at £300,000. So you'd want to limit the reflex. What happens if you do your work badly? How can that impact the client? So anything that's below ground works tends to be riskier. Anything that's just an add-on to the side of a house is different. So you need to kind of think about what sort of project are you doing? What's the cost it could incur to the client if it goes catastrophically wrong? And think about the catastrophically wrong ones and how much insurance you have. And generally, you don't want to put a limit in that's higher than your insurance ever, because that means that you're going to fund any claim above that amount. But also, it doesn't have to be the amount of your insurance, because your insurance could change over time. We know that there are probably lots of claims for insurers for business interruption. That means they're going to get less likely to pay out claims in the future. So you need to take into account how your insurance level could dip in the future. So generally speaking, you're looking at somewhere between 4 and 10 times the project price, less than your limit on liability, but bearing in mind how much insurance you may have in the future.
Okay. It's a risky business construction, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
So a question from Lisa, who's asking whereabouts within the FMB contract is the limitation clause? I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know if you can.
So the commercial and domestic ones are on the it's on the front page. So it's on the very front page of the contract. Yeah.
Okay. And that's it in terms of questions from members, unless anybody wants to ask another question of Sarah while we have her here. I'll just mention in the meantime the upcoming contracts webinars, which Sarah's already mentioned, that we've got the one about contractual remedies on the 26th of January, and we've got another on the 2nd of February about using contracts wisely, which will be our last webinar on contracts, although they're all going to be recorded and they'll be available for some time to come for members to use on the website. And then after that, on the 16th of February, we're running a webinar on the subject of reverse charge VAT, which is something that HMRC have delayed the introduction of, but that will be going ahead on the 1st of March. So we have an industry expert on taxation coming to talk about how to apply the rules around reverse charge VAT, which I understand are quite complex. So that should be a useful one for people to attend. And then after that, we'll be doing another webinar on the Green Homes Grant Scheme, another complex scheme that needs, hopefully we can disentangle for members. So there's plenty coming up in terms of webinars. But I don't think we have any more questions coming in, Sarah, so I think we can wrap up there for today. And we will just, all that remains to say is goodbye to all of our members attending. Thank you very much to Sarah. And thank you very much to you, to the members, for joining us today. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.